So let's move on a little bit to these revelations of Dick Cheney. I mean, these are instances that apparently David Broder has just found out that Dick Cheney has been a very secretive guy, and based on stories in his own Washington Post. But Glenn, let's just talk about Cheney in perspective here. Has these reportings in the Washington Post about Dick Cheney, has it changed your perspective at all on the relationship between George Bush and Cheney? Or is this something that you have seen out there, or is it even relevant? Are they just all one Borg?
You know, I had really mixed reactions about that whole series because, on the one hand, I actually did think that it was an instance of very solid, competent, even you could say excellent reporting. I mean, it compiled a lot of facts that hadn't been previously known about what the people at the highest levels of our government were doing, and a lot of people have been guessing that that was going on and speculating, but it seemed to corroborate a lot of those ideas about how our government has been run for the past 6 years, and in one sense, that's what a good reporter ought to do, is uncover secrets and reveal facts. On the other hand, I really reacted more, I guess, with indifference than I did any other reaction, and I actually don't even think I wrote about it, because what really did it reveal substantively that we didn't already know? I mean, Dick Cheney was given carte blanche by George Bush basically to run the foreign policy apparatus of the government, apart from and even encroaching on traditional arenas of the CIA and the National Security Council and the Department of Defense, really acting unilaterally. And every instance in that series is basically Dick Cheney running roughshod over the law, over legal limits on what the government can do. And only to David Broder is it news, or to other Beltway mavens, that this is a presidency that has, first and foremost, as its main principle, believed that it can act outside of the law and without any limits. And I think it just detailed how Dick Cheney has engineered that.
Atrios, does this give cover to people like David Broder and the Joe Kleins of the world to come out and start saying bad things about the president and the vice president?
I think it does a little bit. So I guess it does contribute in that sense. That is, when the Washington Post, basically the establishment newspaper, publishes a very long series about that, it is in some sense sending a signal to all the other very important people in Washington that maybe, just maybe, Dick Cheney isn't the nice, wonderful man that they thought he was. But as Glenn says, I mean, it's not that we didn't really already know this. It's just that for some reason, perhaps maybe because David Broder, had quail at Cheney's table one day and decided that Cheney was a very good man and therefore wouldn't do bad things. That it's only a surprise to them essentially because they were blocking out all the facts that we were aware of, or at least failing to fit them to the appropriate narrative, which is essentially that this administration, largely due to Cheney, is essentially seizing as much power as it can.
Laura Rosen over at War and Peace wrote the following: "Too bad for us, tough guy Cheney, with his impassioned commitment to torture and secret power, couldn't get bin Laden and lost the war in Iraq with the help of his buddy Rumsfeld." She goes on to write, "Even with all that secret extra legal power he yielded and bestowed for all these years, he couldn't show success on any front when it mattered." Atrios, do you buy this notion that Cheney has been a failure in terms of what his agenda might be? I mean, because we hear a lot about these guys have screwed up Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't gotten bin Laden. It's a failure. But for them, is that really even necessarily part of their agenda?
Well, I think that it's always important to question fundamental premises that people have. And one of them is always that the people running government, roughly speaking, have the good of the country, which is, maybe doesn't precisely fit with your vision of the good of the country, but, some vision of the good of the country in mind. And thus you figure, well, of course Dick Cheney wants to catch bin Laden. Of course Dick Cheney is really concerned with protecting America. Of course Dick Cheney really wanted to spread democracy in Iraq. That is, you assume that those are their motivations, and then you say, oh, well, they failed to do that, so they're failures. But it's not necessarily the case that they actually wanted those things. I can't read Dick Cheney's mind. I don't really know what motivates him. I don't really know what's going on up in that brain of his. But I think it's wrong to assume that what he thinks is a good thing is what you think is a good thing.
But Glenn, we do know from the Project for a New American Century that the theory that for America to be a hyperpower, to maintain hegemony across the world, what is necessary in this age of only one superpower or a hyperpower is to have low-level conflicts that will tie up the resources of other countries across the world. And to a certain extent, I mean, that's what we have. Yes, we are bogged down and stretched thin, but essentially everybody's terrified of everything now in the Middle East, and everybody is sort of locked in what is now could grow into a regional conflict.
Well, I think you can look at two different areas where the blueprints were laid out for what they wanted to do that pre-existed 9/11, and 9/11 became the enabling event that kind of permitted these theories. One is the domestic front, where Cheney and Rumsfeld have craved for decades, restoring what they consider the executive branch to its proper place of primacy in the federal government. And so creating a rejuvenated and all-powerful executive was certainly part of what his agenda was. And then secondly, you're right, there's a foreign policy vision of the U.S. as a global empire, in essence, the hegemonic power of the world that relies upon a series of military conflicts that can strengthen our defense industry and rule by intimidation and ensure that resources are controlled by the United States. Now, whether he wants those two things that clearly are on his agenda because he believes that strong executive and U.S. domination around the world is good for America, or if he wants that because it makes him more powerful and enriches corporate sectors, I think that's the kind of stuff that goes to his motives that you can't ever say for certain. But clearly, what has happened in this country is something that most people consider to be completely misguided, tragic, and destructive. But I think Dick Cheney thinks that they've done a great job and things more or less have turned out the way they wanted.
Yes, I mean, short, of course, of the attack on Iran, but who knows if that's in the offing.